I'm here today with Scott Sanders. Scott's involved with Geneva Push, Reach Australia, and the Gospel Future Fund, and probably a few other organisations. So, Scott, it's fantastic to have you here today. Thanks for your time.
No worries. Good to talk to you, Tim.
So, tell us first of all about your work with Geneva Push. How did you get involved with Geneva Push, and what does Geneva Push do?
Yeah, I went through work. I worked for a professional services firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and went through university and sort of studied part-time and worked full-time for a number of years. And during that time, I got excited about the gospel going to France. France is one of the most unreached countries in Europe, but also in the world. And so I met up with a number of people and some ex-missions and got excited about taking the gospel there. And it was in conversations about France and working overseas that I met Al Stewart, and as a consequence, we started reading the Bible, together, kind of every fortnight in the city, and in many ways, I didn't know, but he was discipling me. He was catching up with me. Just it was something that he did, regularly as just as part of his his walk, and I ended up leaving PricewaterhouseCoopers, went to SMBC and Bible College with a view to doing cross-cultural church planting in France, basically in Paris. And a whole bunch of things happened, and that wasn't the case. So my wife and I went over in 2006, and she wrote 11 pages of reasons why we ought not to go to France and plant a church, and that was kind of the end. For me, that was the end of a 10-year dream. And a number of wise, older men said you ought to listen to your wife. And so I ended up heading back to. Well, I ended up going into full-time ministry, but working in a schools context, in a school near where I grew up in Sydney, as a secondary school chaplain. And it was during that time, probably 3 years in, I was loving it, having great ministry there, really enjoying ministering to the 1,000 kids and the 1,500 plus parents as well. And Al gave me a call. Al Stewart gave me a call and said, "Look, do you want to be involved in this new thing, Geneva Push?" I'd been following it on the sidelines. Mark Driscoll had been making lots of noise, and church planting was kind of the new thing. Everyone was getting into it, and I was like, "This is not new. Church planting's been happening since the church started." But okay. And so I did a bunch of research, looked into the need in Australia, and because I had a passion for it through college and really trained to do cross-cultural church planting, I thought, I'll give this a crack. And so I got captured by the vision of Geneva Push to see hundreds of new churches evangelized into existence. So church planting, you've heard all the cliches and the quotes. It's the single most effective evangelistic strategy. Well, it is if there's a mission strategy and there's an intentionality to what you're doing. Otherwise, you can just be rearranging the deck chairs, or you can be starting a church that just looks like the church that sent it. So we want to see, healthy planting. And so that's how I kind of got into Geneva Push. I was tasked with, I guess, really seeing the network grow and at the heart of it, to support church planting couples to plant churches. And I talk about Geneva Push is all about kind of throwing everything and the kitchen sink at a church planter. We provide a great assessment tool, provide coaching, provide resources, help them, find funding so that they can survive. Because at that rate across Australia, the survival rate, and even, in the Western context, the survival rate for church planters is really low. 40%, 45% survive. And so the whole sort of purpose of Geneva Push was to ensure that church plants got started and were evangelistically effective, but also that the planters survived and thrived.
No, that's great. So I've got two questions for you that flow out of it. One is about the survival rate. Have you seen a change in that? And the second is, again, it comes back to what you're saying. What do you see the true need in Australia is about in terms of church planting?
Yeah, so I can quote the stats from our network. We've probably got, I think, a 92% survival rate, but we're only a young network. We're only 10 years old. So I think we've seen it, better than, I guess, denominational church planting over a longer period of time. But the reality is, in church planting, startup ministries do die, do die sooner or die quickly. And, even in the secular context, a business kind of has 5 to 6 years to run. And if it doesn't last, then, that's okay. And that's kind of an operating cost of business. So my previous life working for PricewaterhouseCoopers was working with, in transfer pricing, and often, that was in startup business, multinationals starting up in Australia. And we're getting called in to sort of argue, well, why are you still earning losses after 10 years? You must be doing something wrong, because the average business would have gone out of business 5 years ago and just shut up shop. So I think, I think the survival rate is better, because I think we do have more systems in place across Australia. But I also want to just challenge the assumption that a church, like, how do you measure success and failure? I think we slowed down a lot of our church planting in the last 10 years. We haven't been starting as many churches, and I know it's starting to ramp up again. But actually, failure is okay if the church plant kicked off and started, and we saw a whole bunch of energy, excitement, and people making first-time decisions. If the church plant doesn't survive, that is sad. But if there's been more people in the kingdom as a result of that, then that's great. And so I think we need to see churches closing, especially the ones that are dead or dying and ineffective. And we also need to be taking those risks and starting new churches. Again, putting in as much in place so that doesn't happen.
Yeah, no, that's great. So that second question now about the state of the need for church planting in Australia. Can you just articulate a little bit about what you see that need is?
Well, the church always needs to be church planting. In some ways, the church planting is the R&D department of the local church. It's where new things are started. It's where you can take risks. If you look, most denominations, if they want to just be growing, they need to be this is Western church data. Ed Stetzer and Tim Keller, you can find the quotes, the data on this, but at a rate of 6%. So say you've got 100 churches in your denomination, you need to be starting 6 new churches every year just to be growing and keeping ahead of population growth. So we haven't been doing that, in most of our denominations. So in terms of the state of church planting, I think more denominational leaders need to be setting targets actively, thinking into how many churches we need to start so that we can keep growing to reach population growth, but then using that goal as a way to then work back and go, okay, well, we need to be raising up these leaders, we need to be developing them, training them, providing spaces and places. And if you think about just our 2 largest capital cities in Australia, very different growth trajectory. So Melbourne, most of its growth is happening in new growth areas. You really see it all the way out to sort of Pakenham, Officer, down that way, and all the way out to Geelong as well. In Sydney, it's actually brownfields growth. We're actually seeing a lot more medium density. 2 very different church planting strategies, 2 very different problems in terms of buildings and space and your missional strategy as well. But both those cities have been growing at great rates, and we need to see new churches started, because new churches reach new people. That's kind of one of the things that we'll regularly say at Geneva Push and Reach Australia.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's interesting you mentioned the 6% figure for church planting. Of course, the NCLS research that we recently had done shows that's probably only about 2% of Protestant churches are actually planting in any given year. So we're well behind the 8 ball at the moment.
Yeah, that we are, and we're working as a network with denominational leaders to sort of encourage them to get those targets happening. But the reality is we've got a real gospel ecosystem problem across Australia. We're actually not raising up, leaders across the board. So, if our college numbers are down, I think in terms of raising up leaders internally for leading church and leading churches and leading gatherings, we're behind the 8 ball. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. I don't think you can put it on one thing, but as church leaders, we need to be owning that and being responsible for the raising up of the next generation of leaders.
Totally agree. Now, tell us about your work with Reach Australia.
So Reach and Geneva are the same company, the same organisation. Although we always talk about ourselves as a network, and so Reach Australia kicked off 2 years ago, and we really have gone through a rebrand. I hate to use the language of rebranding, but in some ways, Reach Australia's got the vision of seeing new churches started and also seeing the established church get healthy so that we can see new churches started. So the vision of Reach Australia is to see thousands of healthy, evangelistic, multiplying churches. And so we've been working hard to get church planting on the agenda in the church as Geneva Push over the last 10 years. And we just more and more we're getting, phone calls from established churches to say, we need a church plant. Can you help us out? And so in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, we were doing a lot more consulting and actually helping churches assess whether they were healthy, work out if they actually had, the plans and the people to be able to launch either a new site or new congregation or a new gathering. And so that's kind of where, Reach Australia kind of started to get birthed. But the idea of also, there was a whole bunch of different networks and people doing leadership development and trying to get the established church moving forward. And so we wanted to collaborate with those partners to get a development program off the ground, a 2-year development program. So Reach Australia for me has, a broader goal, but church planting still very front and center. The fruit of healthy churches will be that first generation, second generation, church planting that we talked about. So, in the expenditure conference, you rightly said the other day, what does a healthy church planting movement look like? Well, it's when you've got a granddaughter church, when you can actually point to, birthing and then granddaughter birthing as well. And there's only a few networks across Australia and a few churches across Australia that are doing that. And, Geneva Push as a network has seen a few churches do that. But the reality is we actually need to get the established church healthy and in a good place so that we can see greater church planting. So that's really what's behind Reach Australia.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I totally agree with your sentiments there. COVID, of course, has been something we didn't plan on. How are you seeing that impacting church planting at present?
Well, I mean, in some ways, we've still as a network, we've seen close to 20 to 25 churches kick off in the last 18 months to 2 years. Now that's below what we were aiming for. We're aiming for 15 a year, and I think we've hit 9 and 11. So in the last sort of two years, I think we won't see the impact of it for about 2 or 3 years. Church planting has a very long, it's a very long process. You're talking with someone, pre-college often, and they need to go and get themselves equipped. We encourage most of our church planting leaders to go and be part of a church plant. That's really one of the best ways to grow and train and learn. And so there's like a 5-7 year cycle. And so my sense is that, we're not going to see the impact of this on church planting for a number of years, because a number of those church plants, the church plants that have been planting in this last 2 years were kind of planned 3 or 4 years ago. I think, at the start of the pandemic, I was anticipating a lot more church closures, but the government kind of put paid to that by giving churches a whole bunch of money and, giving organizations a whole bunch of money, JobKeeper. And so I was expecting and anticipating a lot more churches to die, which I thought would then mean we've got opportunity for new things to start in existing buildings and places. And so again, I think rebirth and death is it's a natural organizational life cycle piece. And so I was hoping that we'd see more of that. I think we've seen some churches slow their launch plans. One of our churches in our network was going to launch in Dubbo just last week. They've had to put pause on that just because they've gone into lockdown, and Dubbo's been quite a high case and instance of COVID. The other thing I just want to say is I think there was a real opportunity through COVID for churches to sort of pause, stop, work on their foundational things, to use the sort of Covey language, work on the non-urgent, important things, build a stronger staff team, think into the maturity structures in church life, help teach people that church is about gathering, and we're feeling that, and we're all feeling that now, in order to sort of get ready for relaunch. Now, we did a relaunch conference last year, and we're kind of, I think pastors now who are in lockdown states are tired, and so they're not looking for another kind of relaunch at this stage. But I still think there's a real opportunity. Even in now, we need to be preparing our people for when we do get a chance to again gather and regather.
Scott, tell us about the Gospel Future Fund.
Yeah, so Geneva Push, alongside Geneva Push, a foundation, Genesis Foundation, they hadn't been giving to church planting. They had been giving to more established works. But as Geneva Push kind of kicked off, they as a foundation decided to give to church planting. And so from the start of Geneva Push, we've seen it, this foundation get alongside church planters and provide seed funding for the first 3 years, and then come in and provide seed funding for a second staff worker. And I guess what that showed me was the importance of funding models that have principles and processes and practices that actually help work with other networks and parachurch organizations, in the sense that Genesis stated you needed to get assessed, you needed to have a coach, and they're going to keep you accountable to those two things. Now, a good church planter will want both of those things, because they'll actually help them plant well and also help them work out if they're the right person to plant. But when you tie money to it, you actually have a reason for doing those two things. And so I guess Geneva Push and the success of that under God, really also came through this, other organizations actually getting alongside, and denominations also getting alongside what we were doing. And so those foundations, they've got limited pools, their money's going to run out. And so we decided to start the Gospel Future Fund 2 or 3 years ago, I guess to sort of get ahead of these foundations running out of money. So we set up the Gospel Future Fund to start raising funds, to start speaking to high net worth individuals about giving to a trust, in order to properly, I guess, leverage kingdom funds for kingdom growth. And so the Gospel Future Fund launched with, it was just one fund, which was a leadership development fund, where we wanted to give to apprenticeships, so internships for church plants primarily, but also existing churches, so that we could actually get more people trained and working in church plants as a way of experiencing church plants. So that was our first sub fund. And then a couple of years in, a generous foundation donated a significant chunk of money so that we could provide funding for church plants and church growth grants. And so the Gospel Future Fund, it operates distinct from Geneva Push and Reach Australia. We've got a number of committees of members who aren't actually on the Reach Australia board, because we wanted to keep money and our mission and our focus separate, so that people weren't coming to us for money.
Yes.
We've set up the Gospel Future Fund also to give outside the network as well. So it's it's got a doctrinal statement, but the idea is we actually want to keep giving, planned giving, and encourage high net worth individuals to give to it, so that they can have greater accountability for their funds. And so the process is open in October annually, and there's those 3 sub funds: Church Plant, which is a church that's under 3 years old; Church Growth, which is a church over 3 years old; and then if you've got an apprentice that you're looking to fund, we do apprenticeship grants. Each of them require some sort of assessment, and you're required to do strategic planning and have outcomes and goals, and we keep you accountable. And it's a rigorous process, but it's a process that I've seen the fruit of, in terms of churches being more planned around the whole process of bringing on a second staff member or bringing on a ministry, so that we actually see evangelistic growth. So that's the Gospel Future Fund. Yeah,
that's fantastic. Well, Scott, I think that's probably about it for today. I really appreciate your input, and it's great to hear your perspectives across a whole range of areas. And I'm sure many people will get a lot out of this watching this interview, and I'm sure you'll get some applications to the Gospel Future Fund as a result as well.
Well, so go to gospelfuturefund.org.au, and applications are opening at the moment. We've just run a couple of webinars, so send an email and inquire. But the website will give you all that you need. Can I just promote our conference next year as well,
yes,
just
certainly.
very briefly? 16th to the 19th of May at EV Church on the Central Coast, the Reach Australia National Conference. We had over 950 church leaders at it this year in sort of hubs all across Australia, and we're hoping we can gather, in the one place this year, subject to sort of COVID restrictions. And so 16th to 19th of May would be really good. And we're actually pushing into that area that I talked about that I think the church is really lacking in, which is that serve space. So how do we develop leaders? How do we do that intentionally? And the whole conference is going to be really focusing about mobilizing the body. So I reckon it's a really important one for church leaders to get along to.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
Appreciate your time. Bless you.